My name is Tomasz Wawrzyniak and I work at the Department of Polar and Marine Research at the Institute of Geophysics, Polish Academy of Sciences. And I go to Svalbard since 2008, so it's been 10 years already. And I visited many places, so I have lots of pictures. And during this short lesson, only 30 minutes, I'll try to present as much as I can. And I hope that you can join my tasks that I prepared for you. So could you please prepare your mobile phones, or you will log via your computer, because I have some questions to be filled, to be answered. Right. So I divided my presentation into a few parts. I'll start with general characteristics of polar areas. Then I'll tell something about the history of settlements in Svalbard. Then I'll show you some charts that will tell you about socio-economic situation of contemporary settlements of Svalbard. Then I'll show you some existing infrastructure and construction problems. First question is, what characterizes polar regions of the Earth? And that's question to you. That's something that I would like you to answer. Okay, so this will stay here. It will be open, but I'll go back to the presentation. I also listed the answers here. So you have basic ideas what can characterize polar areas. And of course, these ideas that I put here are not fulfill the answer, but yeah, those are listed here. Extreme climatic conditions with low air temperatures during the most part of the year. So that means long, cold winters and short, cool summers. Violently strong winds. There is no trees, usually no buildings. So winds can be really strong and there's no cover for them. Polar day and polar night associated with high latitudes. That means that there's no sunsets or sunrise for parts of year. Of course, glaciation, as was mentioned by some of you. That means glaciers and ice sheets. Recently, we have ice sheets only in the Antarctic and Greenland. There is also presence of frozen ground, permafrost, which is impermeable. So that means the water doesn't go through frozen ground. It stays frozen above or on the surface. And there is also poorly developed tundra soil, and that means scarce plant cover, the tundra formation. Each of geocomponents, such as those listed here, climate, geomorphology, and hydrology, had in the past and still has influence on the location of the settlements and all constructions in polar areas. That means the environment has huge influence on everything what human can do in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. You mentioned polar day and polar night. That means climatic and light barriers, but together with rocky ground, those three make it impossible to develop agriculture. So that means no plant growth there. There is also gravitational barrier. In mountainous regions such as in Svalbard archipelago, there are large elevation differences, and slopes hinder development of housing, construction, transport, and others, because there are avalanches that appear when there is snow cover on the slopes. Another problem is water supply. During winter, all the reservoirs, streams are covered with ice, and during summer, when the glaciers melt and the active layer is formed above the permafrost, there are floods that can also periodically occur along the streams. So it can be flooded, or there can be just frozen water that has to be melted to be used as fresh water supply for people and animals as well. And despite those factors that I mentioned that limit the development of settlements, permanent human settlements have developed in the Arctic and in Antarctic. This was mainly due to economic and political aspects, but recently what we observe is the natural beauty of the landscape that becomes more and more important for visitors. So people just want to go there to those remote areas because they want to enjoy, they want to see, they want to take pictures in such remote places as the Arctic or Antarctic. So there are many companies, travel companies for tourists, and recently tourism and science are the most important for settlements. But it wasn't like that in the previous era, in the past. The largest settlement in Antarctica is Mcmurdo Station, that's American scientific station. It's capable of supporting around 1,250 residents. So you can imagine it's a small village for such huge continent, but still, the harsh conditions there, you know, they are barrier, but they didn't stop scientists to do their job. They just went there, and now they spend lots of time doing measurements, and they have to live somewhere, so there are many stations also on the continent of Antarctica. I usually go to Spitsbergen, to Svalbard, because our station is located there, but there are also other settlements in Svalbard that I will show you in following slides. It's close to the North Pole, but still is around 1,000 kilometers from the pole. Few informations about Svalbard archipelago. That Svalbard means all islands that are located between latitude 74 degrees and 81 degrees north, and between longitude 10 and 35 east. The biggest island is Spitsbergen. The area of Svalbard is 62,000 square kilometers. Spitsbergen is 39,000 square kilometers. Landscape is mainly glaciers. So this area is highly glaciated. So all the glaciers, ice caps, cover more than 60% of the area. And there are also mountains, valleys, and glacially eroded fjord systems. The climate of Svalbard is influenced by oceanic currents, the West Spitsbergen Current, which is branch of Gulf Stream, warm stream that warms this area from the west, and from the east, because West Spitsbergen Stream flows from the south to the north, and in the east there is East Spitsbergen Current that goes from the North Pole down to lower latitudes and brings colder water masses. So there is difference between climate between western and eastern Spitsbergen, and most settlements are located on the western parts of Spitsbergen. Due to ice conditions on the eastern side. Mean annual air temperature in Spitsbergen is around -6 degrees. The warmest month is July, with mean temperature around +5 degrees. During winter and springtime, mean air temperature is around -15 degrees, so pretty cold. There is also low annual sum of precipitation, which amounts around 500 millimeters in western part of Spitsbergen and 200 millimeters in central part of the island. There is a legend that Vikings found Svalbard in the 12th or 13th century, but there's no evidence for that. There are some Icelandic books that Vikings reached Svalbard, but it is likely that Pomors, which were hunters and fishermen from the White Sea coast of Russia, they knew Spitsbergen as good hunting ground already before it was officially, let's say officially discovered by the Dutchman Willem Barents expedition in 1596. That means the end of 16th century, and since then Svalbard and Spitsbergen became known in different parts of Europe because after this expedition the information was spread. The information about rich wildlife, about whales, about different animals, for example polar bears, that could have been hunted, and that's what happened. Soon after Barents' famous journey, the first phase of whaling started in Spitsbergen's nearshore waters. After the whale was flensed, that means the flesh and skin was divided into parts. The blubber was brought to the whaling station, and in the beginning they were stationed on shore. And there were also huge copper pots in which the blubber was boiled, and that's how the whale oil was produced. And this oil was used for lamps, for example. And there were years of intensive hunting that had almost led species of whales to extinction. Recently, there's just few whales around Svalbard, but their population is growing. But they were almost extincted in the 17th and 18th century because the industry of whalers was so expensive. And as you can see on the picture below, there are some remnants of those whaling stations. You can see me on top of some remnants. Those are whale schools. After whalers came hunters and trappers. They were hunting, for example, for polar bears. Since 1973, they are strictly, it's prohibited to shoot polar bears. So it never happened after that. There are no hunters in Svalbard recently. But some time ago, many bears were killed for their fur. In the 19th century, there was beginning of scientific expeditions. The scientific exploration of Svalbard has concentrated largely on the collection of data that described topography, geology, biology, botany, oceanography, glaciology, and climate. And these remain most expanded scientific fields that are continued until now. For example, there was a scientific expedition, Russian and Swedish expedition called the Arc of Meridian. And that expedition that was placed in two stations in Spitsbergen. For example, in the south there was Russian Konstantinovka, as presented on the upper picture, and recent picture of Konstantinovka is shown below. And this expedition was to define the shape of the Earth by means of very precise astronomical determination of latitude and longitude, as well as topographic work. So they've done lots of measurements. There was also expedition by Andrei, one of the most popular disaster. Andrei expedition, there were 3 members of this expedition and they vanished. They used the hydrogen balloon. They wanted to go from Svalbard to Russia or Canada, passing North Pole. This would be the first reach of the human to the North Pole. But when they left, they disappeared, and for more than 30 years nothing was known about this expedition, and in the 30s of the 20th century the members were found, they perished in one of the islands, Kvitoya, in Svalbard. Only remnants were found. But from the 20th century the mining was developing because the beginning of the 20th century is the Industrial Revolution that rolled over Europe. So newly industrialized countries demanded large amounts of raw materials, and coal was especially in high demand. And because the coal was so important, Uh, Scientists, geologists were looking where to find it, and coal was, for example, found in Svalbard. And in the beginning of the 20th century, Svalbard remained no man's land, so no country, yeah, there were many countries that wanted to have this area, but no country was agreed to claim this area. So at that time, there were many countries that were developing the mining industry in Svalbard, and due to hard conditions and this chaotic actually claims and occupation of different areas, and yeah, the coal wasn't easy to be taken because the geology is really complicated in Svalbard. So after the beginning, it wasn't, didn't earn money when reaching for this coal because it was so expensive and complicated, so it wasn't worth to still have those mines. So countries were selling their mines to other countries. For example, Sweden sold their mine, United States sold their mine in Longyearbyen, but I will show you some more pictures of those mines. Most of them are closed recently, but there is still little mining activity in Svalbard. But in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, that was the main thing that, because of that, people were settling in Svalbard. And because this area was, the field of conflicts, in 1920 a treaty was signed in Paris, which put Spitsbergen under Norwegian administration and sovereignty, but guaranteed free access for citizens of all signatory nations, as well as demilitarization. So there's no possibility to have any military soldiers, tanks, or whatever in Svalbard. It's demilitarized. There are several additional nations that acceded after the treaty, and as for 2017, there are 46 parties or countries in the treaty, and each of those countries has the freedom of scientific, exploratory, and tourist activities, and their citizens have equal rights, and those rights are governed by Norway. For example, by Norwegian law, there are protected areas, such as 7 national parks, 6 nature reserves, and 15 protected geotopes and bird sanctuaries. And in this area, some activities are prohibited. I mentioned that there are some bigger settlements. For example, I will show you Longyearbyen in the central part, as you can see the circle in the middle. Then I'll show you Barentsburg, Ny-Alesund, Pyramidal, and also Hornsund in the south. The population in the settlements, these data come from ssb.no, so Statistics Central Bureau of Norway. And as you can see, in the second half of 2017, altogether, there were 2,752 persons in Svalbard, and most of them lived in Longyearbyen and Ny-Alesund, and also in Barentsburg and Pyramidal, more than 500 people. At Hornsund, at Polish Scientific Station, there were 10 people living for a whole year there. Here are some statistics. As you can see, different age of people that live in Svalbard recently. As you can see, there's more men in some ages and more women in others. As you can see, most people that are that live there, they work there. So they work in different companies, in service, in mining, in travel, in tourism industry. So most of them are in age between 30 and 66 years old. That's how Longyearbyen looks like. It was founded in 1906 by American John Munro Longyear that bought the mine there. And today, that's the administrative center of Svalbard. There is Norwegian Sysselmannen, the administrator, that has his office there. There is also a university called University Center in Svalbard, UNIS. There's also hospitals, supermarket, hotels, range of shops, bars, restaurants, and other services that are open for tourists that come in numbers during especially spring and summer. The population is growing a little bit and more houses and flats are built. Although the fluctuation of people is high because many inhabitants complete a contract that lasts just over 2 or 3 years and then return back to Norway or to other places where those people live. This is how the center of Longyearbyen looks like. That's the office of the governor of Svalbard. In the back you can see the, here, University Center in Svalbard. There are courses for students. All the constructions in the Arctic, in the permafrost zone, are set on such piles as can be seen here. And those piles are drilled. There is drilling rig, that's the machine that drills into the ground. And it drills down to the frozen ground because frozen ground is solid. So those piles won't move when the ground is frozen. Another machine is pile driver. Those drivers push the piles to the ground. And of course, those piles are for a reason, because there would be heat from buildings that would warm the ground temperatures. And warming ground temperatures would unstabilize the ground, so it will move and shake the building, so buildings could collapse. That's why those buildings are set on piles that are drilled into permafrost. As you can see, recently we observe climate warming. That means deepening of active layer, that's unfrozen upper part closer to the surface above the permafrost. And once the active layer is deepening and deepening, it's thicker and thicker, that means instabilization of those piles, so buildings start to move, as can be seen, for example, in Longyearbyen. I mentioned also about floods that can occur when during melting at the end of spring, the beginning of summer. But high on the mountain slope, around 120 meters above recent sea level, there is global seed vault, a special building that attempts to ensure against the loss of seeds in other gene banks during large-scale regional or global crises. That special building for seeds that come there from around the globe. So seeds of different plants are frozen and remain there just in case if something happens in the future, they can be used to be planted again. And there's, of course, different barriers, climate conditions, but there's also another danger, wildlife. For example, polar bears are also dangerous for people. And as you can see here, people carry protection against polar bears. Those are not for hunting because polar bears are protected, but you have to protect yourself if polar bear attacks you. So most people carry rifle, and if you go from the city, from the Longyearbyen to the field or wherever you are, not in the city center, you need to carry rifle. But in the city, you cannot take your rifle into the bank or to the market. You should put it somewhere in the safe place and go without any gun to the bank. As you can see, lady here, she just finished her shopping and she's going back home. carrying her rifle and riding a bike. I mentioned about Ny-Alesund, that's the settlement in northwest of Spitsbergen. Ny-Alesund is former mining settlement, but in the 60s it was of the 20th century it was decided that mining has to be stopped because it's not worth it to take the coal from this area. It's too expensive. And in the 60s and from the 80s it was decided that Ny-Alesund will be international center for research, and it became such research station with picturesque mix of old and new buildings. And there are many countries that have their scientific stations in Ny-Alesund. For example, Italy, Netherlands, China, United Kingdom, France, South Korea, India, Japan, Germany, Norway, and France. Here are some remnants of the mining era. A train. And recent view, those buildings are used as stations, as scientific stations or hotel, as seen in the back. In the front, you can see Roald Amundsen monument. Ny-Alesund was the place where the Norge started its journey to the North Pole. That was the airship, as you can see on the picture on the right. To the left there is a tower when it was set, before it started to fly. And actually that's the first verified trip to the North Pole that was documented. And this flight was verified, and it took place on the 12th of May 1926. So that's the data of reaching the North Pole by man. In Ny-Alesund there are the most northern buildings in the world. For example, the most northern post office. Here is Cantina. And some stations, for example, to the left you can see Norwegian scientific station, to the right Chinese scientific station. And there is also Russian settlement, Barentsburg. That's the second largest settlement on Svalbard recently. It was named after Dutch explorer that I mentioned before, Willem Barents. And it remains a Russian mining town with coal mining conducted by the company Arctic Ugol. It started in 1932. Russians had in the 20th century more mines than only in Barentsburg. They also had mines in Grumantbien and Kolesbukta and also in Pyramidal, but those were the activities in Pyramidal and Grumant well stopped. In Pyramidal was abandoned in 1998 and Grumant in 1962. Here is the aerial view of Pyramidal. That's the ghost town, so-called, because it was abandoned in 1998. Recently there is some activity in the hotel, so tourists can come, visit, and go with the guide provided by Russians. That tells the stories about this settlement. In the end of the 80s, on the 20th century, there were around 600 to 900 people that lived there. Recently, only seagulls are the most settlers of Pyramidal are seagulls and other birds. There is monument of Lenin, the most northern monument of Lenin in the world. You can see here the birds that nest on the abandoned flats. And in the south there is Polish polar station Hornsund that I mentioned. It has 10 inhabitants. Those are scientists or observers. The station is managed by my institute. and is located in Isbjørnhamna Bay of Hornsund Fjord. It was built in 1956 and conducts year-round scientific research since 1978. And this is the most northern permanent Polish scientific site. There are also other Polish stations that are used not throughout the year, but just seasonally. So many universities from Poland have their stations in Spitsbergen as well. So lots of science is going on there. And access to Spitsbergen is recently really easy because there is airport. The airport was built in 1975, and 1975 is the end of the era when Svalbard was accessible only during summer and spring, when ships could come to Svalbard when there was no sea ice. Since there is the airport, you can go to Svalbard actually almost every day, because there are flights from Oslo and Tromsø in Norway. There are also sailing boats that come, especially during summer. Some of them stay for the overwintering and are frozen in the fjords and are used as hotels. There are some ships that come with supplies. For example, that's Horizont 2, the Polish ship that comes with supplies to our station twice a year in June, July, and the end of September, or middle of September. Because there are no roads between settlements, so only in those mentioned settlements, in the towns, there are some roads. But between them, you can go only by boats, such as rubber boat, as seen here, on skis. That's something that some people do. Dog sleds, that's mostly for tourists. And of course, snowmobiles. Snowmobile trips have to be prepared because you can go really fast using snowmobile, but if something happens in the field, the weather can change, your equipment something can happen with your snowmobile, with the scooter. So if you stop somewhere, you have to be prepared to set a camp. And there are also helicopters, but those are not for commercial use. But I'll go to Svalbard next Sunday, and on Monday I will go by helicopter from Longyearbyen to Hornsund Station. So I will use this mean of transport. So the question is, would you like to live in Svalbard or other polar region? The answers prepared are: I would love to, yes, but no longer than 3 years, yes, but only for a few months, and never. No, those conditions are too hard for me. I wouldn't live there. Oh, there is first answer. Someone would love to live there. The other answer is no longer than 3 years. And here I'd like to finish my presentation.